Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you are. I'm Lisa Berkeley, and this is Reaction to Response. We are an opportunity to hear from thought leaders who are helping us shift from fear-based reactions to care and compassionate-based responses. I'm super excited about today's call, but I do want to go over a couple of housekeeping things. And first, Reaction to Response, as many of you may know, is birthed through the Charter of Compassion International's Women and Girls sector. We are in over 400 cities with more than 1,800 partners in 53 countries, and we're divided into 12 sectors of society. You can learn more about us, as well as our speaker, at charterforcompassion.org. Also, today's call is being recorded, and if you have any issues, you can go to zoom.us if you're on the call live. And then also, if you're on the call live, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you will see a space for Q&A, and also in the chat section, you can feel free to comment. We've got some awesome people working with us behind the scenes: Sandy Hart, Brianna Lathorpe, Susan DeGaia, and Betsy Spano. So big hats off to them. Thank you. And without further ado, I just want to tell you a little bit about today's guest with us, Preeta Bansal. Preeta's experience in very high-level governance, combined with her profound commitment to living a life of compassionate transformation and healing, is simply stunning. Her credentials range from serving as general counsel and senior policy advisor in the White House under President Obama and advising on the drafting of the Afghan and Iraqi constitutions, to serving by appointment of President Obama as a member and committee chair of President's Advisory Committee on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, where she focused on poverty and inequality in America. Today, she's doing some pretty phenomenal work, having always been interested in outer forms and structures of democracy, as based on her background as a constitutional lawyer. She's now focusing on the inner work of democracy, or what Alex de Tocqueville referred to as the habits of the heart. And she's now looking at what forms and local venues of our lives that bring the constitutional structures to life. I think I need more coffee. Anyway, Preeta, I'm so excited to have you with us, and let's just jump into our conversation. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Lisa. Great to be here with you.
Yeah. You know what? I realized I forgot one thing. Our usual format is we have You're in My Conversation, where people can interact with us through chatting, and then we move to what we've been calling the Reaction to Response After Party, where we go into breakout sessions or more interactive. But today we have a hopefully exciting new technology. So at the end of our conversation, after an hour, we'll be able to just bring everybody else in. So that's kind of exciting. So for those of you who are here, luckily you get to join us automatically. I've had some very exciting and enthusiastic reading of some of your previous material, and I adored our pre-conversation that was just so much about not only your background, but where you are today. And but can you just tell us a little bit about your background working at high-level governance?
Yeah, so, well, I guess I have to start with talking about my experience as an immigrant child growing up in Nebraska. My parents came to this country in the mid to late 60s from India, which is where I was born, and I was just a couple years old. So grew up in the extreme Midwest, Nebraska and Kansas, where back then there wasn't a lot of diversity. In Nebraska, I was like one of, I was the only minority in a high school of 2,000 people, probably close to the only non-blonde, very Germanic Scandinavian stock. So anyway, I had a wonderful upbringing in Nebraska, felt very, totally assimilated in that environment. You basically assimilate or die. We completely assimilated, and just kind of had this a little bit of a, meteoric, achievement, immigrant-based kind of aspiration of just rising and achieving in education. And so did all that stuff. Went to Harvard College, law school, became a constitutional lawyer, practicing constitutional lawyer. What was it? A number of law firms, practiced as an appellate and constitutional lawyer. I was in the Clinton White House. I was Solicitor General of the state of New York. I did a lot of human rights and religious freedom work as chair of something called the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And that was while I was also practicing law in New York City. And then joined President Obama's White House as general counsel and senior policy advisor in the White House within the Office of Management and Budget. So, had, was always kind of, always very interested in governance, in the structures of governance, in our constitutional structures of governance. So that's where I put a lot of my energy.
Wow. So you've just made me think about a few things. First of all, especially working under a number of presidents, but especially under Obama, and with your background of being in a very white environment, and just to sort of tie this a little bit more clearly into this month's theme of compassionate cities and governance, I wonder to what degree, how should I ask this? The racism that you probably experienced helped keep your heart open and keep you in a space of care and compassion and moving into the various leadership positions you've had.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I'm not, it's funny, growing up, I'm not sure I would have characterized it as racism because I didn't really know any different. There really were no outlets for feelings of difference.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was a part of me that obviously that was very different. My family was culturally Indian.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I just kind of buried that away at some level, kind of in a box in my heart that I kind of just didn't open until much later, because when I had a safer atmosphere in which to probe some of those feelings.
Mm-hmm.
But, I'm not, so I'm not sure I would characterize it as racism, or at least feelings of racism, but definitely feelings of difference.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think, I've always been interested, when I came out of college, I was very interested in social justice and civil rights issues. I'm sure that was a huge factor in that without labeling it as such. But always interested in, and I also my grandfather on my mother's side was a lawyer in India and very much a Gandhian freedom fighter. Mm-hmm. So I think had a lot of those instincts and had heard kind of a lot about that growing up. So I think I had a lot of those instincts within me.
Well, the fight for equality, or I always hate saying things like the fight for justice or the fight for equality, because it sort of implies we go into that fight or flight mode rather than, the work for equality and stuff. So I just changed my own language. So one of the things that we do as part of the reaction to response series is we look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so I'm curious, and I'm going to just put them up on the screen here, how they have tied into, or if they have tied into your work. There we go, they're up on the screen. And so when you look at them, like, what are your initial thoughts about?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. It's okay. All good. Oh, hold on one second. We've got you on mute still. Oh,
okay. Sorry. Okay. Who's just trying to... Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. So, obviously these are really, really important goals in terms of, aspirations for all societies to achieve. I guess, in the current state of being that I'm in now, and the kind of frame of thought, I'm focusing just personally, much more, not just on kind of these kinds of external plans and programs. I think that, but how do we foster the kind of inner transformation within us, to encourage people to have kind of shifts in the heart that allow them to achieve some of these things, a bit on their own. And that sounds a little cold. I don't mean to say that, it's incredibly important that we have structures of governance that support the people to live without poverty, with zero hunger, with good health and well-being, with quality education. I guess I've just come to increasingly view the limits of kind of external institutions to deliver these things to us. So this idea that these are goals that our systems of governance should try and achieve for us, I think that's wonderful, because I think these are absolutely the goals that those systems should be achieving. I've just become, more of the view that these aren't going to be goals that are delivered to us, but rather goals that within communities we must work towards within ourselves, and that includes transformation of our own kind of just small daily actions as daily acts. So
So, oh, you've just already touched on a whole bunch of things that I want to get into a little bit more, especially around the role the individual plays and some of the work that we've come up with here as far as the SDGs and based on previous conversations. But I'm going to take a step back for a second and go back to some of your work within the system, because you've just kind of mentioned that as far as what are the challenges that you face working within the system? I mean, or wait, let me rephrase that, because that's such a big, like,
Yeah.
phrase. And so one of the things, go ahead.
Well, I guess it's not, I want to step back. I guess when I think of challenges of working within the system, I'm not sure I would phrase it that way. It's more just challenges. Look, I think we're kind of at an inflection point in some ways in our history.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we're seeing, and I think it's really very much affecting our systems of governance. We have such a complex society. We're seeing increasing complexity. It's hard to believe that, we're going to have this kind of top-down institutions being able to deliver for us. So I think this notion, we've had of kind of top-down governance, our 17th and 18th century institutions of the state, I feel like they're kind of reaching a natural inflection point, kind of like we saw with the rise of the printing press. We saw, the decline of the Holy Roman Empire, the rise of nation states. We saw just vast transformations and vast social reorderings. We saw that again with, the rise of the steam engine. It led to an outpouring of moral philosophy, Adam Smith, etc. Then we saw that with the rise of railroads. We saw the rise of corporations as a form of governance. So I think, we've had points in history where we've had kind of, technological change combined with, moral and philosophy, changes in our moral philosophy that have led to kind of systems of governance that have changed. I guess I feel like we're at one of those inflection points now. And so it's not so much that it's the challenge of working within the system. I feel like, we saw this a little bit, in recent elections where we're just seeing the role of social media. We're seeing our whole social sphere transformed in so many big ways. And I think it's an open question about whether our, traditional institutions that were described in the Federalist Papers, our constitutional system, will, what kind of tweaks will have to be made to that, or will naturally be made to that with different forms of social technology. So to kind of try and answer your question, I think that this idea of sitting on high, and I felt this, like, we were dealing with this vast federal budget where you're so disconnected at some level from people who are actually solving community problems. And obviously we tried, I think in the Obama White House, we did so much to support local communities in terms of trying to shift funds in the direction of more place-based and local community work. But at the end of the day, we have these vast impersonal systems of governance that are quite disconnected from where the delivery of services is going. So I think, one of the challenges is how do you kind of revive that sense of localism, that sense of local community, that sense of agency that people have in their lives, not only for themselves, but for their immediate communities.
So in one of the articles that I had read, and I will be sure for those who are watching to post this on the in the follow-up email where we share this video, in one of those articles, you gave the analogy of the Mobius. And it was or not the analogy, well, yeah, I guess analogy is the right word, of the Mobius, this infinity-shaped design that twists and reflects this inside and out, and as you're talking, that's kind of what comes to mind of how do we take the large and bring it down, and sort of this expansion and contraction and top down but bottom up at the same time. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I should give credit to Parker Palmer, who is really the one who kind of came up with this notion of the Mobius strip, which is something that I really have latched onto. Again, like I in my life, I viewed social change and the need for how to bring about social change as very much working at the systems level. I thought, oh, if only, you just keep working your way up, and when you're in a key role, you're in a position to influence change from the top down. And I think for me, my own transformation has been going from, top to, big to small, realizing that systems change, not only at the big, but also in the kind of small micro behaviors that people within the system have, that the power of each individual to really
Mhm.
shift around them.
Right.
So from big to small, kind of from outside to inside. So again, like not focusing on, bringing change to others, but how do I change myself?
Mhm.
And how does my changing myself start shifting the energy around me? And then from, so I call my shifts from big to small, from outside in, to inside out, and from head to heart. So when we were talking about kind of the challenges of governing and achieving these sustainable development goals, I'm just skeptical a little bit, increasingly skeptical about the our ability through our heads to
Mhm.
deliver this. And our system of governance is obviously a head-based system, but it's,
Mhm.
how do we ignite individuals' hearts,
Mhm.
and and the small micro behaviors that bring all of this to life.
Mhm. So I also, you mentioned, and again, I think it was the same paper, I may be confusing a couple, but I was so deeply moved about that we were speaking about the founders of the Constitution being really enlightened beings, and who I think you were talking about had read, sciences and religion, and you talked about the spirit of what we were founded upon. And so a lot of my background around social justice and things sort of gets a little bit more hooked onto, yes, but it was white men who were writing this document primarily. And so how it has left people out. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the intention of the spirit of the law, or the spirit of the Constitution. And then, because when we talk about that, and when in your writings about it, I thought, wow, this is really also is empowering to the individual to switch or shift from their head to their heart a little bit more. And I'm wondering if that awareness of the spirit of it and the background of the writers of the Constitution has influenced at all your consciousness, I guess, or your awareness of the larger to the smaller.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think the founders of the Constitution were very much keyed into the importance of providing a space for the life of the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
It's not surprising that the first freedom in our Bill of Rights is the First Amendment, which includes the freedom of religion and freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, in the language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But you know and they believed in creating this structure of government that would allow individuals to thrive and individuals to live according to the life, to their conscience and their spirit. And I think kind of increasingly, and that was, it was a rural agrarian society when the nation was founded. I think increasingly, we have kind of lost that sense of the structure supporting our own self-governance.
Mm-hmm.
And we've kind of we've started looking increasingly to government to deliver,
Mm-hmm.
for us, as opposed to providing a safe space or a structure for us to deliver for ourselves. I mean, interestingly, and this is, you quoted it when you introduced me to Alexis de Tocqueville. I mean, I think de Tocqueville found when he did his, tour of America in the early 1800s, he found that what was really amazing about America were the kinds of small venues, the local venues that spirit and association and community thrived.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the magic, he felt, of the American spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think over time, you know, as cities have become large, as we've kind of increasingly moved to more urban environments, as our systems have just become so large and complex,
Mm-hmm.
that sense is kind of lost a little bit. So I guess, not entirely, but I guess I think of it as like shifting in my own life, shifting from a view of government as providing the answer, which is kind of a form of outsourced governance, to governance. Like, how do we govern ourselves? And I kind of bring in Gandhi's ideas here about Swaraj, which is self-governance, and peer-to-peer governance. How do we kind of recreate the sense of community and village within these very large institutions?
It's so interesting because as you're talking, I'm sort of reflecting on what's happening. And, when you've talked about Alex de Tocqueville and his journey across the country, so I'm thinking about my own drives cross country, right? And this shift, and again, this like big to small. So, to your point, right, we have this possible hopeful change of big governance to something a little bit smaller, but also the big businesses, and now this rise of artisanal businesses, and let's go back to mom and pop stores. So I think you're really speaking a deep truth to what's happening on the collective, that the bigness doesn't actually serve the heart of the individual. And so I know that there are a number of people who are maybe working in or living in small towns or smaller communities where maybe there was big business, maybe an oil industry or a car industry, and that business has left. And now what was once a thriving community is really struggling and this balance of how do we, what's the role of the government, or how can a small person, an individual in their community, help rebuild their community. Do you have any insights on how people can make that shift from on the very local level, from big to small, in revitalizing a community?
Yeah, well, that's a big question.
Okay, nothing like throwing you a big question. We can be here for a week.
So, I think when I think of the move from big to small, I mean, that's obviously a big part of it. I personally have moved back to Nebraska, where I've grown up just recently, to start experimenting more at the local, small level. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But I think what I think about it really is also even smaller, like the really micro shifts that we undergo. I mean, our system of governance was founded upon kind of a story of separation, which is, I like to think of it as, our 18th century institutions. If you look at like Federalist 51, we basically said if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Our founders set up a system where individual vice would turn into collective virtue. So where ambition was meant to counteract other ambition, and collectively we would have harmony because of the competing interests of the competing self-interests. So that's basically founded, and that happened at the same time that our economy was shifting to, more of a market system, where again, this idea of Adam Smith's invisible hand, where self-interest competed against self-interest, and somehow collective virtue emerged from that. That's based on a certain view of human nature as egoistic, individual, atomized. And it's separate from one another. And it's a historically contingent view of human nature. It's obviously led to a lot of, growth and a lot of economic abundance for so many populations. But it's also not the only story of human nature. If you go back to the time of Aristotle, an individual was viewed as fulfilled only in community with others. The basic unit was not the individual. It was the city-state and the role of the citizen within that. Right. So we didn't have kind of the basic, as I said, the basic unit being the individual. So, I guess what I'm saying is I think, right now we're seeing our current systems of governance are based upon a story of separation. I think, maybe we're seeing, a natural inflection point where a new story, the story of interconnection, and we're seeing it with quantum physics. We're seeing it in so many areas where we're understanding that we are not separate selves, that we're stardust, and our atoms are constantly exchanging with one another. So, maybe I think, in the same way that we saw science dramatically shift from the beginning of the 20th century to the 21st century, it may be time that different view of what is the basic unit starts shifting our vision of governance. So I can't. Sorry,
No. You're the wheels are spinning. In fact, and so I'm just listening to you. And then I was looking at a chat from someone, but I want to just before I address the chats, the question comment. A lot of what you're speaking about is very much related to the City of Compassion initiative, which is really the highest ideal of of the movement, is very much about what you're talking about, bringing it back to the individual. And in fact, we talked about this in our last conversation with Mayor Fisher and Tom Williams, both of Louisville, which is considered a leading compassionate city, because they're really focusing on what in a city is uncomfortable and how do we address it at at the individual level, and how do we empower community to it's not just take responsibility, but actually engage and open the doorway, to your point, to shift from head to heart and act from a place of compassion in revitalizing or rebuilding the city. So I think you're
Yeah.
speaking.
So to go back to your question, sorry, I was.
No, you're good.
And I guess I was thinking, like, when you were saying, what are the small behaviors we can do to revitalize local communities? I think of it as just, starting to live that story of interconnection. And that means small acts of kindness, generosity. These are the kinds of things that, probably years ago when I was in my heady days as a constitutional lawyer, I would have thought, oh, that's lovely, that's quaint, that's sweet.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought that was the stuff of serious governance necessarily.
Right.
But, my own shift has been to recognize that is exactly where the action is. It's how do we create the spaces, the community spaces, the structures, the norms that allow people to do those daily acts of kindness, to feel that connection with their neighbor. And that's where I think change really happens. It's not, I don't know if we're going to be able to bring, the auto body shop back that's gone under, but, maybe it wouldn't go under if we're actually supporting our neighbors and local communities, and not necessarily, the large box stores that come in from elsewhere. But, the idea of a living local economy and really supporting that, I think, starts from those really micro behaviors and starting with that story of compassion and interconnection.
All right. Okay. So there, I'm like watching a whole bunch of chat stuff going on. So I'm going to put a pause on this. I'm going to jump over to some of the chat questions. Do you know, this is from, I can't see her whole name, but so I'm sorry, I'm not going to quote names here because I can't see everybody's name. So apologies to those who are submitting questions. Do you know about the Holistic Chamber of Commerce movement? How about getting all the churches, spiritual groups, and caring activist groups to write and enact legislation for heart and soul community service with a basic guaranteed income with single payer, to replace recruiting for more armed forces and militarized police with single payer?
Wow. I'm not familiar specifically with the Holistic Chamber of Commerce movement. I know there are several movements that are generally focused on bringing some of these energies back locally. I know there's the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. There's other kinds of things like that. So it sounds like a wonderful movement. I guess I think the role of churches, spiritual groups, and kind of caring activist groups are critical to this whole scenario. And which is why, and that's where a lot of my current focus is. I guess the part I'm not sure about is getting them to write and enact legislation to create this thing. I'm not sure you need legislation at the end of the day, or again, that's putting a lot of emphasis on the role of external coercion and government. I think if we really want to kind of incite or trigger these habits of the heart, it's just doing it. It's just starting it. And I think it spreads with ripples in that way. So I guess my focus would not be so much on kind of trying to enact legislation, but it would be certainly about trying to get churches, spiritual groups, and caring activist groups to try and, to try and ignite these small acts.
Right. So you just touched a couple of things that are very much part of the Compassionate Cities initiative. One, which is, to get people more and more engaged. And just for those who are not aware, I think you are, but I'll just quickly touch on it. Charter for Compassion was born through the work of Karen Armstrong's work, which was really looking at the world's religions and what is the underlying theme of compassion. And so this really speaks to what you're saying. So even more, makes me even more excited and happy that you're here with us, because you're really reflecting those values as well.
And to go back to the Mobius strip for a second, I don't want to be naive about the role of the external system and legislation and that, but I do think, I think the inner part, so the Mobius strip is, as we talked about, was Parker Palmer's notion of, it's an infinity shaped thing, but what it really is it's a band. So if you think of like a circle, or a band that's joined together into a circle. If you turn one kind of inside out, what ends up happening is as you trace the inside, it becomes the outside at one point, and the outside becomes the inside. And the notion here is that everything that we do within us, like the actions and the changes we take within us, ultimately reflect in the outer world, and the outer world ultimately manifests in part in our inner world.
Mm-hmm.
Systems affect the way in which we view the world in our hearts, and our hearts affect the world.
Mm-hmm.
So you can change. You really need to change. You can change from either, or you can change from both.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that right now, with so much emphasis on kind of systems and governments and coercion, and I think right now for me, my interest is really in kind of the inside. How do we start changing from the inside? And then how does that naturally and organically manifest and ripple out into the outer world?
Right. And I think too that one of the challenges, and this, we touched on this a little bit, again, going back to Mayor Fisher and Tom Williams, the question was coming up, well, how do you write legislation, or is this part of your city plan? And what was sort of revealed was that you just start it. You start it, and then you'll get buy-in from your city council, and then slowly, it changes in the actual written intention of the city plan, as well as various ordinances and such that can help make care and compassion be woven throughout. But one of the challenges I think that people face is they want to do good, they want to be of service, but yet they're still juggling. Oh my gosh, I have to feed my kids, I have to take care of my expenses, I'm working 9 to 5, or maybe even more realistically much longer, with 1, maybe 2, or even sometimes 3 jobs. So given the structure that we have, the shift to heart is that much more challenging. And so I think, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
I think it's important to acknowledge that, because when we also can acknowledge that this is a growth opportunity, this is like, wearing old shoes that no longer fit our feet. And so it's uncomfortable. And so in this context, right, we can't just take the shoe off and say, throw it out, or recycle it or pass it on. We have to sort of work together, and it is uncomfortable. And I just want to acknowledge that, because sometimes we speak at high level conversations such as this, but when it comes to hitting the ground, it's difficult to do sometimes.
And I think it's important when we think about these kinds of changes to not only think about compassion towards others, but compassion towards ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so it is hard, and we have to honor where we are and what we're capable of doing, and what is comfortable for us,
Mm-hmm.
and what is true for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be different for different people at different times, and that's fine. There's no progression as such. We're all at a certain, we're supposed to do what we're meant to do. I think of, like, when we were talking about the kind of legislation versus just make the small acts, I think of the civil rights movement, and was it Thurgood Marshall who argued Brown versus Board of Education? Was it the Supreme Court through decree that caused change, or was it Rosa Parks, an individual who just sat down who sat down on a bus one day? Or was it Martin Luther King and the churches that he mobilized, in the spiritual communities, the religious communities, to lead a broad movement? I mean, the truth is, it was all of those things. And it's hard to tell what comes first, what's more important. The truth is that it starts, rippling out into many spheres. And so, Rosa Parks sitting down and getting arrested was certainly a very uncomfortable act. The people who then boycotted the buses, and still had to, the African-American community in Montgomery, they still had to work to get their livelihood. They still had to get to work, but they couldn't use buses suddenly.
Right.
So for weeks, I mean, it was terribly uncomfortable, terribly difficult. And so, I don't think this is the thing we can kind of head our way to, like through our heads get to. There will be a moment where, I think for each of us, where it's like, we have to make this shift now. And we feel within our own life the fierce urgency of now to start living a different story. But until we feel that, this kind of thing shouldn't be a should. It shouldn't be something we, just are not compassionate towards ourselves about.
That's really an excellent point. I think too, and I think this is one of from our earlier conversation in advance of this call. You mentioned Rosa Parks, and that there were probably a number of other women or people who moved to the front of the bus, but she was sort of the tipping point. And so I put that in the context of how many people today are doing small little acts of kindness and goodness that maybe seemingly go unnoticed, or people feel isolated that this is not making a difference, when in fact it's the snowball effect. It's building and building and building until, oh my God, there's a huge snowball coming at our house. We better do something, and make a change. So it's just, again, the little acts. And I think your point about self-compassion is really relevant. Do you want to add anything before we go on to another question?
Yeah.
So the question is, how to get current nationalist extremists to see the Constitution as an enlightened document for everyone, to see each individual as spirit versus matter, how to help these narrow minds to shift from their anger when they do not want to interconnect, or how do we? Well, you thought my question was big before.
Yeah, I guess all I can, it sounds Pollyanna-ish, and I certainly don't claim to have any answers. I'd love to hear what other people think about this. But for myself, what I'm trying to do is just trying to be the change as much as I can. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying not to view people as extremists, or trying not to label them as such, and just trying to understand, and I'm back in Nebraska, where there's, a much more of a mixed population politically than there was certainly in New York or Boston, where I've been in the past, or San Francisco. And I'm trying to just really listen to people's stories and just try and give them the safe space to express themselves without a whole lot of judgment. So I'm trying to suspend my own sense of labels and trying to hear what is the hurt that they're expressing. Mm-hmm. So, I don't claim that that's going to solve everything, but just in my individual sphere, that's what I'm trying to do right now.
Well, that's so important. And very often a lot of the quote unquote extremists are just doing what they were raised with and learned. And there's an element of, systemic or transgenerational lessons that have been learned, rather than, oh, is this really what I value? And how do I know it's true? And that if we can hear the fear, and that doesn't mean, again, to use your words, not to be all Pollyanna-ish here, but because there is real harm that's been occurring. But if we can hear the fear and begin to address with and work with that, that's really the opportunity for transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe, again, just like here, as you said, here, understand what's hurting them. It may be expressing itself, that hurt, in a way and in language that we don't necessarily think is the cause of the hurt or the real cause of the hurt, and maybe is a distorted thing. But I think it's really important to understand what is that hurt, and it's deep. And I see, and as I hear people, it's not even what it's not even like an I don't even think it's a race-based thing. Mm-hmm. It's just kind of an anti-system thing. I think a lot of people feel that our systems of governance have failed them, mm-hmm. that people aren't, that they're elite systems, that there's, certain entrenched interests that never hear the common person. Mm-hmm. And, putting aside who's in power and who's not in power, or what party, or any partisan things, I do think that we're seeing kind of a lot of, maybe some of the growing pains I was talking about with the inflection point about, our systems having to shift in some ways. Mm-hmm. Federalist 10, sorry to go back to constitutional, Federalist 10.
No, it's good. So it's good. We get to learn more. Yeah, go.
Federalist 10 talks about kind of the state versus the nation. And as the kind of local locus of governance, they say the state is where, people come together in more kind of local self-governance, and the nation will kind of prevent or help hold in check the factions and the kind of factionalism that grows at the local level. I think we're at a point now where maybe both of those poles are no longer the right poles. The state is too big of a unit to really have people feel necessarily all that meaningful self-governance. And then the nation is maybe not big enough to really, with the internet, with so many trans-border stuff, the question is whether the nation is really the right unit of regulation in a lot of areas where you have so many spillover consequences. So you're kind of seeing both poles kind of pulled apart. So a desire for much, much more local and kind of, local control, and then also a desire for kind of broader containment of some of the transnational effects of things.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I think about this is, with technology and the internet, we have an opportunity for, an opportunity and necessity of kind of shifting a lot of things. So I think of it as like maybe the technology is not making us a global village. They say, we're becoming a global village, but maybe what we're really seeking is to become a globe of interconnected villages, where we each have kind of a smaller realm in which we feel that sense of personal agency, but also the kind of connection to the broader whole.
Right. That's such and it's funny when you said that, I immediately went, okay, because that feels much more manageable. If you're talking about smaller interconnected communities, I'm like, okay, that's digestible. We can work with that. And by doing it that way, it also allows for a greater respect and compassion for differences. So, I don't have to assimilate another country or culture's viewpoints into mine, and they don't have to integrate mine into theirs. We can figure out a way of how do we share life affirming systems, and how can we honor our differences as well. And just the point here was made that, going back to our conversation around the Montgomery boycott lasted 381 days, with some people walking 20 miles or more each day to work. So again, I bring that back because it's uncomfortable, this period of time. And I think it's just so important to acknowledge that piece, and Karen Armstrong actually speaks, and when we talk about the compassionate cities, and I said it before, but I'll reiterate, it's uncomfortable. We go to where it's not comfortable in order to bring healing, in order to bring awareness, in order to have compassion for self and for other. And it does take time.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, how do you get the strength and the resilience and the staying power to stay at it for 381 days? I guess I would say that doesn't come from the head.
No.
That's not like, you can't discipline yourself into doing that entirely. I mean, there's obviously a huge element of discipline, but that has to come. There comes a time when in our hearts, we can't live another story. I'm sure there came a point where Rosa Parks just could not stand anymore in the back of the bus with these empty seats up front. There comes a time, and the entire community agreed this was the time.
Right.
So I don't think we can beat ourselves up too much about it and think, and this goes to your point earlier that, I have my bills to pay. I have all this stuff. How can I be all this compassionate towards other people? It can't be something that is a shoulda, coulda. It has to, it only happens when it's a must. That it comes from deep within us, that this is the way I have to live, and I have to tell a new story. I have to live another story.
Right. It's, I think, more a calling, and to your point too about it's really the integration of head and heart. It's where I can no longer live out of integrity with myself and with my values, assuming, of course, values are in alignment with affirming life. And when I say affirming life, let me be very careful here, because I know that that's a very loaded word, especially when it comes to women's life and reproductive rights. So affirming that a community will thrive and raise all individuals within that is what I mean. And so in one of our conversations that we had earlier in the Reaction to Response series, it was actually with Bob Zuber of Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. Sandy Hart, who is the director of the Women Girls sector, when we were reviewing and really delving into the UN Sustainability Goals, said, we really need an 18th goal, which is self-awareness and personal agency. And for those who are unfamiliar with this, this is what we've kind of included it to look like. And it really does speak to a lot of what you're talking about. And I think that when we talk about self-awareness and personal agency, self-awareness includes having compassion for ourselves, and also recognizing too that, today I need to just take care of my children and not be out in my society doing something, because that's also going to elevate it a little bit more as well. And so I'm curious though, when you see this and when you reflect on your own experiences working from governance and bringing it back down to community, does this speak to you? What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, as I've said, like my focus right now is really, it's not so much focusing on government change or systems of government change. It's focusing much more on that, what you've described as the 18th goal,
Mm-hmm.
bringing tools to communities at a very local level to create that sense of self-awareness and personal agency. In some cases, that might be mindfulness. In some cases, it's healing circles. But there's a number of different tools to get people to do the deep inner work,
Mm-hmm.
and but in community with others, where it's not just you're off, um, in this kind of isolation, but in community with others. How do you do the kind of individual and collective deep work?
Right, right. So what so I'm trying to, like, I have so many questions right now about, like, in your personal story, and I don't want to pry too much, but in this shift from being of service to the nation to going inward and reflecting more of how can I be of greater service. Can you talk a little bit about that shift, because that might help people say, okay, I'm ready to go back to integrate the values of my heart a little bit more.
Yeah, so I guess I can say I think my whole life I've been a bit of a spiritual seeker. I've been, very, very interested in religion and spirituality. But I would say that, if I had to be honest with myself, I would say for much of my life it was a bit of a heady pursuit, where I would read a lot about different faiths, read about a lot of different religions. At one point, I was chair of something called the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, where we met all of the major religious leaders around the world and really worked with them to try and, increase the conditions for religious freedom in their countries. So it's always been something that's been something of great interest to me. It obviously was touching my heart, but I would say I lacked the tools of the heart to connect with it at a heart level. So what I would do is I reverted to my head, which was what I would do. And I would read about things, I would learn about things, I would meet people, I would be fascinated. But it was really when I left the White House actually in 2012 after the first Obama term, that I did my first 10-day meditation retreat. And I had even meditated for 10 seconds before, much less 10 days in silence.
It's a culture shock. Wow.
I just did the deep dive in, and not really knowing much about it, thank goodness, because I think I would have found a million reasons not to do it if I thought too hard about it. But I did it, and literally the earth cracked open underneath me. I felt something so deep, and I felt like finally I had a tool for really going within me in a way that I had not before. And that was just the beginning. I mean, you can't just do 10 days and everything shifts, but 10 days, my lens shifted. And then after that, for the last 5 years, I've gone pretty deep into various personal spiritual practices, mostly meditation. So I do about 2 hours meditation a day now, yoga, other forms like, certain kinds of, eating and Ayurveda, and just different things, writing. I'm doing a fair amount of, writing prompts and things but I've just found this amazing flow start to happen for me. And I feel, it's just been a really wonderful shift for me personally. And, I don't know, maybe that's all it is. And that could very well be all it is. But, I'm starting to also, as I've explored my heart much more deeply, I'm seeing that how much so many of the really big shifts in the past, historical shifts, like whether we talk about civil rights, whether we talk about something else, they have come from those kinds of, shifts of hearts. So, again, so I'm just, it's not even something I'm thinking that hard about. It's just naturally happening. As I deepen myself, as I do this work within myself, I find myself just wanting to just be in a different space, work on a different set of issues, think about things differently. Everything's just shifting. And we'll see. I can't tell you where it's going to go, but
well, but you know what, the fact that you have the courage to say, I can't tell you where it's going to go, is also an indicator that, okay, you're trusting, you're on the life. This is what life is, and who knows what's going to be tomorrow. And I think when you speak about shifting from the head to the heart, the head, we like to control, we like to know what's going to happen. And certainly, in at least my experience in the counterterrorism community, is there's this real head-based thing. But actually, when you get underneath it, there's a fear, right? There's a fear. I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to make the mistake. I don't want people to judge me in a negative way. I don't want to be outcast from my professional community and such. And yet the conversations in person do recognize the heart. But this is also kind of what you were speaking about too, is you were so in your head. Some part of you could touch your heart a little bit, but to stay there required real deep personal transformation. And so one of the questions when I hear you speak is like, how have your former colleagues embraced this path that you're on?
Oh, I mean, I think they're really happy for me because they see it's a great path for me. They see I'm very happy and that it feels right for me. I think, I think initially there was, I'm sure some people thought, what's happened? Like, why aren't I not doing the things that, one should keep doing, which is to keep climbing. But, I don't know. I mean, I think for the most part, people have been pretty supportive. They've been a little puzzled at times. But, it got to the point, it's kind of what I was saying before. It's if it were just a head-based decision, if this were just my head saying, oh, I need to do something different, this is not what I would have done. I mean, it would have just, it just got, I got to my own personal fierce urgency of now where I just had to live a different story. And so, I don't know. It was my, I don't know what social implications will come from that. If any. Maybe there will be in my immediate surroundings. I don't know, but it was just something I just had to do. And I felt I got to the point where I started feeling like, I felt like I had to live the Hippocratic Oath in my life, which is first do no harm. Right. And wow. Sometimes in our desire to keep doing and rising and taking more action, and they're all well motivated. I would never say anything that people do in the public sphere is not well motivated for the most part. Right. I think the vast majority of people are very well motivated. But I think there are limits to what our head can divine for other people. How much can we really solve? How much can we deliver no poverty for everyone else? Every time we create a new system, a new set of laws, there are a lot of problems. There's a lot of harm that comes from each system that we create. Right. Sometimes I feel like we just keep dismantling old systems, creating new problems. And, yes, I do believe the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but I'm not sure there's a lot of ways that it could do that. I'm not sure that has to be through legislation. I'm not sure that has to be towards big prophylactic type of changes.
Right. It's like a lot of the, perhaps writing new legislation is akin to like creating a Band-Aid for a wound, when in fact what you need is like a whole surgery of clean out a very, very deep wound, and you need stitches and antibiotics, not just a Band-Aid.
Yeah, and you get to the point where our systems are so broken. I mean, you think of our healthcare system. I mean, how much energy is how much expense and money and time is put into treating conditions that are when they get to be such catastrophic conditions, and how little is put up front in terms of prevention and holistic maintenance. And if you just think of just our health, the ways in which our resources are so completely diverted. So you work on healthcare legislation, great. I mean, yes, it's great to give everyone universal coverage. I mean, it's critical, but they're being covered for the whole system is broken. So at some point, it's not the kind of thing or most people or most politicians, I think, can single-handedly remake. So you almost have to go small. You have to remake yourself. You have to rethink of your own body differently. You have to slowly start affecting the people around you differently. There's I've been working a lot at MIT Media Lab the past few years where I've been teaching, and I feel like there at technology, you have these beautiful incubators for small experiments to create things. I don't feel like we have that kind of luxury anymore with governance systems because our systems are so big. How do you pilot new ways of doing things? I think you can only do so in small communities, in small experiments. So, so that's kind of where my interest is these days. How do you, you can talk about it as, there's so many different analogies you can use, but how do you create some positive, just insert a few positive platelets of blood into an otherwise, massive system? Can that start making some shifts?
Wow. Okay. That's yeah. Good question and a good place to start. And I just noticed the time. So we have about 5 more minutes left of this conversation before we include everybody into the conversation. And so I'm wondering, in this format, any concluding words that you'd like people to take away as far as their own capacity to affect change, or anything for that matter?
Well, I do think, yeah, I guess I would say it's, you know, it's the Gandhian vision of change yourself, change the world. I think we so often think about how can we change this, what's around us? How can we be part of creating a better society, a better, you know, government, a better nation, a better city? And I guess I would encourage people or invite people to think about, you know, how can we change ourselves? What shifts in the story we live vis-a-vis other people can we start implementing on a day-to-day basis? And, you know, and ask the question, is that going to be the way in which we really shift the world around us? I think it is. I'm increasingly convinced that I don't need to think about everybody else or how I want to change the world. I just have to change myself.
Amen to that. Yeah. Okay. So I think we're going to shift in a second. Before we do, though, I just want to reach out to everyone who is on this conversation, and we're going to shift you over in a couple of seconds. But from behind the scenes, everyone will suddenly be brought in one at a time. So if you're sitting at home and you do not want to be brought into the larger conversation, I'm going to invite you to thank you for being with us. And our next Reaction to Response webinar will be November 1st, and our theme is going to be switching then, and we'll be addressing women of color in honor of the courageous women of color who are really working to shift social justice and human rights into a more pluralistic environment so we can raise up everybody. And so that's going to, our next conversation will be November 1st. And I think that's about it for now. Sandy, I know that you're running the show back there. I don't know. I think we will be seeing people joining us as we go for it. This is the first time that we're not switching platform. All right, here we go. Here's everyone here. So we're going to keep recording. So again, for all of you who are joining us, we are still recording, and your video cameras, you can decide if you'd like it to be on or off. And what else can we say? We're going to switch a little bit to a different format view. And also for everyone too, your microphones are muted. We're starting off with people muted, and you have the capacity to unmute yourself. We're going to do this in a little bit more of a structured way than we normally do the Reaction to Response series. It is an open conversation of which you can engage with Preeta, but I am going to ask that you keep your comments or questions very direct, so not a lot of talk around it, that you keep your questions short and simple, because we only have about half an hour and we do have a number of people here with us. Sort of add to that when you're not speaking, if you can keep your microphone muted, because we'll be getting feedback. And lastly on that, if you do go over time, I will apologize in advance for kind of inviting you to wrap it up, or I will interject. So Preeta, though, before we go into this, thank you so much for being here with us. What a phenomenal information you shared, and exquisite heart that you've been sharing with us, and your wisdom and everything like that. And I see Sandy, Director of Women and Girls, nodding her head. So
absolutely. On behalf of the Charter for Compassion International and the Women and Girls sector, we thank you so much for your contribution to the series and everything you're doing, Preeta. You're such an inspiration and a beautiful model of what's possible in our world. So thank you very much. And moving from what should be to what must be. That resonated deeply with me. Can I just do a slight bit more of housekeeping?
Absolutely. And then I just do want to take 1 second, though, also just to acknowledge that Marilyn Turkovich, the Executive Director of Charter for Compassion International, is here with us on the call. So, I'm so happy to see you here, Marilyn. Thank you. I don't know, Marilyn, if you want to say anything or not, and I've just totally put you on the spot. So you can decide if you want to speak up or not. In the meantime, did you want to go through more housekeeping stuff, Sandy? Go for it.
I just want to say, and it looks like Marilyn's going to
Yep.
speak up. Real quick.
Excellent.
Let me just say that all of you are muted automatically. You'll have to unmute yourself manually at the bottom of your screen. If you bring your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see your mute button on the far left. And I also want you to know that you have an option to see everybody at once, what we call the Brady Bunch style, up in the top right-hand corner of your screen, floating your cursor up at the top. You'll have speaker view, and you can toggle from just a few at a time to all of us that are here on the call. And here we have Marilyn.
Right. I just wanted to say thank you as well, but so much of what has been talked about today reminds me of the graphic that was on top of the newsletter that was sent out yesterday from the Charter, which is kind of a networking mesh of the entire world. And I'm also reminded of a couple of our communities, like Denver, for example, when they decided that they wanted to begin to look at their compassionate city, they said, oh, this is pretty overwhelming. So they started by neighborhoods. And so they went from one neighborhood to another until finally, a few months ago, they came all together and said, okay, you know, we're working in that direction so we could think of ourselves as a compassionate city. And we have a lot of examples where that's happened. Toledo started out to be a compassionate city, and then before you knew it, it became the greater Northwest Ohio group. And so, you know, I think this is a wonderful idea. And, you know, just going back to India, I think about the villages and, you know, how village is it the panchaya, where, you know, you get together and you have the elders of the village who really kind of are respected and are there to help solve the problems. And I think all of that is part of the networking. You know, how is it that you use the wisdom of a community experience, and then, as Margaret Mead said, you know, give me the young people, give me the old people, forget about the people in the middle because they're not going to get anything done. And so that was just some of the things that resonated in listening today. So I'm anxious for the rest of the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. Just very quickly, I see that there are a couple of people who is Cindy. I don't know if everyone was raised to panelist or not. There's just, I'll invite you to check in the chat, Cindy, while we continue the conversation. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Marilyn. Okay, so anybody have any questions or comments directly? And for Preeta, you need to unmute yourself.
If I could just say something in response to Marilyn. And, you know, it's interesting. I think it's important. I mean, I think there is your citing of India. It's important not to also idealize the panchayats, which also, you know, have had their own histories of both good and bad. And I think I always think of, you know, at the end of the day, structures are just structures. It's the people within them and their moral capacity that makes it happen. So I'm going to butcher the quote, but there's a beautiful quote that says that. Anyway, I'm not going to bother. I'm going to butcher it. Something about how that the external impact of something is only as good as the internal condition of the person delivering it.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's a beautiful quote and comment. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off before for your response. Sorry.
I'm saying that because there have been some terrible cases where, you know, panchayat elders, the men, have often rendered punishments in ways that constitute violence against some of the women in the villages. So there are some, you know, I wouldn't want to idealize any particular form. I think trying to get to wisdom in any community structure is always, you know, that is a high bar for anyone.
Well, see, before I respond, this is a challenge with this new version. Okay, anybody?
I'd like to talk.
Okay.
Lynn.
Hi, Lynn.
Yes, I totally disagree. I think what's happening on the planet right now that we have internet, cell phones, and we have language apps, we can really figure out that people have to grow up and we have to evolve quickly. We truly need to teach and train people. Think about it. If you teach and train people instead of coping with drugs and learning war and violence, and how many young Marines, 8 to 12-year-old young Marine programs, how many people are being taught to use drugs, use fear, cope with violence, and be taught to war? If we can teach people to war, we have 1,000 military bases in 156 countries. Surely we can teach and train people hands-on healing, quantum touch, soul work. Who are you? Why are you here? Hey, if you're angry or upset, get with somebody who can calm you down, get you connected to source, find out who you really are, why you're here, and move them into community services. We can teach and train anything. We have the capacity right now to bring in a new WPA, CCC in every community. You start teaching and training movement therapies, multicultural arts. There's a USDA.
Lynn, I'm going to interrupt you for a
Soul
minute.
education and job creation and mass media support. We can do it all. Hurry up.
Right. Okay.
Come on, churches.
Yeah, okay.
Wake it
up. Lynn, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
No, your voices are that's, I appreciate your disagreement. And you make some valid points. And do you have anything specific? Well, I'm gonna thank you, and I'm gonna say, do you want to say anything in response to that?
I mean, I don't disagree that I think healing programs are wonderful.
Yeah.
I think we agree with that. I don't know that mandating them or forcing people to do them is going to have the same effect.
Oh, if you pay them, if you line them up and you pay them, you've got jobs like all around the community. We have 22 501c3s, 22,000 501c3s in Oregon alone. If you're paying those people at a heart and soul resonance, where they want to work in the communities, what they want to do or learn a business, you're paying them instead of going to where you're paying them to help each other.
Lynn. Okay, thank you so much, Lynn. I appreciate it. Some good ideas. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna go on to the next question. If you can please, Mike, mute your mic because there is a little bit of feedback. So thank you. Let's see. Hold on. I don't know. So I know. That Bree is coming in from the UAE, and so I'm wondering. I know sometimes we don't always get to chat from her and don't always hear her before it's interrupted. So, Bree, I don't know if did you want to ask something?
No, I'm just really absorbing all of the. There's so much wisdom, and I don't think anyone is in a disagreement with what Lynn is saying, other than the fact of trying to mandate systems. I think that what we're seeing, particularly from our last conversation with Mayor Greg Fisher and the Louisville community, and what's being spread out throughout the mayors across the country, as well as in different communities around the world. It may start at the top, but they're moving bottom up. You know, they're not necessarily mandating or legislating. They're introducing these ideas, and then they're getting a groundswell of support from the community, and it's expanding exponentially. And I think, whoever brought up the idea of churches, of course, that's a great idea. But it's introducing new systems, and it's really essential for that to happen. And I agree with Len. Yeah, very quickly.
Did you have a particular question for Preeta?
No, I didn't. Thank you.
So, go ahead. Did I see a hand up?
I was actually going to invite and put Marilyn on the spot again, because I think this is such an important conversation to highlight the power of the cities of compassion, because they are really top down, bottom up. It's the Charter for Compassion, City of Compassion movement is really a bridge builder between the grassroots, the critical mass of all the stakeholders of any given community, to work in partnership with local government. so the voice of the community is empowered and elevated, so that that the local government is listening very carefully, because they've basically, to Lynn's point, committed to an agreement. In other words, the resolution that they come together to sign.
Right.
And that is heart by heart.
Well, I think that, just to piggyback on what you're saying, Sandy, I think that though we haven't been around for a very long time, I think we have found that if you do not have a grassroots organization, mayors change, city councils change, intents often change, but if you have a strong community networking together with a strong partner base, so that if you look at the success of some of our compassionate communities around the world, it's not only because you have a core group of people who are working on the issues that are difficult, uncomfortable, oppressive, etc. It's also because you're looking to work with people who are really achieving some great things in your community, so they become your partners. And I think that, I'm myself, and many people on this call probably have lived through programs that have been challenging programs, but also at the far end of things, probably have brought about a great deal of good. Having spent most of my life in Chicago, I think about the people who were part of the Hull House effort. Jane Addams starting it all the way back when she was a resistor to the First World War. But that tradition continued until the 60s. And it was so interesting because as I worked with community organizations and worked with leaders in communities, the link was always somehow to Hull House, that, they got their early bite into social responsibility by just being a part of that organization. And I think that that's something that we want to do with the Charter for Compassion, that we want people to have that association with social justice, restorative justice, all of the things that make it worthwhile to bring to the forefront in your community.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. Before I jump in here, Preeta, did you want to say anything? I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, no, that to me seems, what Marilyn says seems exactly right in my experience, just in all kinds of different change efforts, that it's, leaders come and go, politicians get out of office, there's shifts, but it's the kind of grassroots support that ultimately keeps these kinds of momentum, the kind of momentum alive.
Mm-hmm. I always kind of think of it as sort of, the purpose of governance is really to be at the service of the community. And I also think of it in the context, given more of a background in the healing arts and such, that governance and military, et cetera, are like an immune system. They're there to like sort of protect, or if the immune system gets out of balance, that becomes sort of self-attacking against the self too, an autoimmune disease. And so if you think of the population as the full body, the healthier the full body gets, the less you need a very strong or potentially autoimmune system keeping us quote unquote safe, because we've learned that real safety, again, to your point, when you talk about going into meditation and doing the work of the heart, the health of the heart recognizes that real security is in our adaptability to change. And that when we can do that, we're safer in the world because we're more fluid. And so my question actually for you, Preeta, is in this vein. Do you see, when you've gone more into your heart, it's changed how you look at world events versus when you were in your head working as a constitutional lawyer, general counsel in the White House, et cetera?
Yeah, completely. Not even a little bit. Just small ways. I used to read 15 newspapers a day, just constantly, keeping track of everything. Now, I'm much more careful about how I use my mental energy, and don't try and get it wrapped up in every little 5-minute thing that happens, because one could become very agitated every 2 minutes if you were listening to the news. So kind of trusting that things that will really matter will stay relevant for several days. I don't need to check it every 10 seconds.
Yeah.
Things like that, but just, like really choosing where to focus my attention. I mean, I'm starting to realize increasingly that the only real freedom we have in life is where we focus our attention. So, what stories do I want to focus on? Do I want to focus on the stories of, all of the bad acts happening in the world, or the name calling? Or do I want to focus on things that allow me to live a new story, that reinforce that new story in my mind? So I focus on, a lot of the acts of compassion that are happening around the world, because it allows me to keep acting in a way that's more compassionate. I could totally, there's so much, there's obviously so much in the news that can cause a lot of distress. And I'm not saying to close one's mind to that, but recognize how that affects you.
Right. So this is really an interesting point, and I see a lot of heads nodding here. And this is something I know that certainly through this series we're trying to explore a little bit, which is, if there's a real social issue, to not suddenly say, oh, we're going to we're going to ignore it. Instead, we're going to focus on the good things, but really acknowledging the pain and discomfort. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, this discomfort, focusing on the good while acknowledging and working to elevate the pain and heal it. Is there anybody who has yet to ask a question? There are a number of people who are off screen. So if you have a question or comment, please go ahead and put it in the chat. Let's see, hold on, I'm just looking quickly.
And if I just, when we were talking a little bit about the mayors, the compassion mayors, the compassion city mayors, I think the role of leadership ultimately, I don't think you can start things. I don't think things start from the top, but I think what you can do is amplify. You can amplify the good. And I think that's what we can all do in our own lives. It's where we focus our attention, but also where we choose to kind of reinforce. I think, it's not to be naive that there's only good in the world. There's obviously both, but we can choose to amplify one side of the story. And that's, if we can all act as amplification agents, then I think that's where the news story starts getting told.
Excellent. Ellie, I see I see a chat, and now I see you're on screen. Excellent. Happy to see you. Please. And I saw you in Greece. Yeah.
Okay. Hello to everybody. I am from Greece, from Athens, and I'm here with my 2 children. I am a psychologist, and I am passionate about compassion. I work with compassion-focused therapy, if anyone knows. And my question is, my husband, with whom we fight sometimes, he's a communist, and he's very involved in changing through the politics, so that we can have better life, working situations, health for everyone. And my question is, I realize that I shouldn't work individually or only with my friends, only with my family members, that in a way he is right. We need to reach to the community. But my question is, how, since I have this, connection to the Communist Party and him, how can we bring less anger, or how can we transform the anger, the fighting, and make it more constructive? And because really it's about understanding why people refuse to make compassionate choices, the leaders, the employees, the big companies. And so if you have any inspiration, or if anybody has answered this before, can help me. And I will unmute it because I have a baby here who's complaining.
Well, I'd love for others to try and answer it, but I guess I feel like it's just answering the question for yourself. For me, it's answering the question for myself, like, what makes my heart sing? Who do I want to be around? In what environments can I be the most compassionate? because if I am able to be compassionate, then I think that will kind of affect the environments around me. But there are certain situations where there may be people that are so different from me, so that I may not be able to maintain that stance all that well. In which case, I think for me, the answer is maybe that's not my highest calling to work in those atmospheres until I'm prepared to do so. So I think it's like really just finding for yourself what makes your heart sing, and who can you be around that makes your heart sing.
Yes,
For
but
me, can I say something? We're all connected.
Wait, Lynn, hold on, not yet. 1 second. I think to answer the question, to take that also, this challenge of the individual and the social, right? So in the world that we live, life is expansion and contraction in everything, right? And so as an individual, when do we expand out? And then when do we go back in? And so I think, some of the best ways, and I'm reflecting on some of the research that's been done on international peacemaking. And when they get to a stalemate, one of the smartest things, and it is usually a woman who does this, goes and finds a child, brings the child in the room, and starts talking about the child, the grandchild, the future. Because suddenly when you see so here you are, you're here with us with your children. You've just brought a very different reality into this conversation. And so when you talk about influencing the party that you have, perhaps inviting people over for tea and having a conversation about the future. Never mind making a strong political stance, because to Preeta's point, and sort of what we spoke about earlier in the conversation, is very much about heart to heart, and that behind the scenes, there's more courage to speak heart to heart, but maybe in the public arena, a little bit less so. It's changing. But maybe you bring people into your home for a cup of tea with your children.
that is a very, very good idea, because usually the communist members, they always are thinking about how they will do something to others, and I thought maybe I will join them to do the same. But actually, yes, I can be compassionate towards them, and thank you.
And it can just be small acts. What if you just decide that one day when you're with them, you're just going to smile at every single one of them every time, and just create a different physical energy in the room?
Yeah. Preeta, will you share? You sent me some of your.
This is from Sophia. She made a painting for you all.
Oh, bless her heart.
Thank you.
Preeta, you shared in some of our pre-call conversations and notes, you shared an exquisite story about a military man in Afghanistan who was in the middle of overturning the compound. I don't remember off the top of my head. You're nodding your head, so will you please share this story, because it's so relevant to this topic.
Yeah, I think what I should probably do is send you all the video, a link to the video, so you can watch him say it in his own words. But in a nutshell, basically, this was an American Marine who was on patrol in Iraq, and he was responsible for finding weapons caches that might, upset the military effort there. So he came upon just this stunning garden in Iraq in the middle of a desert, and it was just such a beautiful garden. It was a man's house, and he thought, wow, well, of course that's got to be a weapons cache. Who keeps a garden like that in the middle of a desert? And so he said he and his colleagues, they just ripped apart this house. They dug up this garden. They just completely destroyed it for purposes of finding the weapons. And in the middle of doing this, just wreaking havoc on this man's home, this Iraqi man, out of the corner of his eye, he sees is coming over towards him, and he brings him a cup of tea. And he just starts, the owner of the house, he starts asking him, how are you? Asks him to tell a little about a story, where he's from. Doesn't say anything, doesn't, berate the man or anything like that. He just serves him a cup of tea. And this ended up changing this Marine's life. I mean, he went back, he ended up leaving the Marines. And then he told the story all over about the man who, just by serving a cup of tea, showed what humanity truly is about in the midst of the worst thing that could be happening to him, his home being destroyed. He is able to just reach out and touch and be compassionate towards the people that are doing this for him. Anyway, this man then goes, he talks about like how this ripples out, and the story had profound implications on him. He then goes back home, he leaves the Marine, goes back to Ohio, starts telling the story in his community. And then he says, at the end of the day, then he sees all the people it's touched. And then he says, it's hard to believe that one Iraqi man on a single afternoon where his house was being destroyed was able to create this kind of tsunami of change through one small kind act. So I'll send you the link to the video. It's a beautiful story where he tells it in his own words.
Marilyn, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say something. I was just thinking, wouldn't it be great to kind of pull together all of the lessons learned and bullet point them from today's talk? And I think certainly going back to Ellie, I think it's important that we find like-minded people. They give us strength. And the strength that they might give us is the ability to communicate with people who are thinking differently from ourselves. And I think that that's, one of the big responsibilities of being involved in compassion. And I was looking at part of the chat from Lynn here, who's talking about the 700 indivisible groups. And a real part, I think, of the compassion movement is to try and bring together a network. And Lynn, what a contribution that would be, because you would be bringing into the network all of these different groups who have causes that are really important and should be linked together. And, the other thing that I'm kind of reminded of, and then I'll keep quiet, is Paulo Freire in Brazil, who really, try to work with people by listening to them, so that, not bringing a deliverable product or a philosophy or a theory or a process, but actually listening to the people, and in most cases, doing nothing but responding, or perhaps showing them pictures of different houses, which was one of his first things that he thought about in working with college students. How do we teach people literacy? And by just doing those kinds of things, really inviting people to ask questions of one another and searching to find out, what is it that's so difficult in living in this community? Or how do we feel that others are really oppressing us? So I think that, that's the kind of thing that this compassion movement's all about.
Yeah, if I could just add, for me, one of the most inspiring communities, and I agree completely, it's all about surrounding yourself with people, having a group of people that can help reinforce the direction you want to go in the face of a different dominant direction, perhaps. For me, the most inspiring group of people has been, it's a movement around the world. It's called Service Space. And they put out daily, something called Daily Good, which you get beautiful, uplifting stories. They put out Karma Tube, which is that video, which is the source of that Afghan man with a cup of tea video that I just shared with you. They have so many kind of portals that kind of amplify the good and the new story of interconnection that I think is it's definitely out there in the world. So many people are living and believe in that story, but it needs kind of more public amplification.
Amen to that. The quicker we get it out there, the more we can all be like Rosa Parks and all of the other courageous individuals who have had the courage to show the way for this. So we're now at the 9:30 mark, which is our usual ending time. So I'm going to just sort of wrap this up with it. Just again, a huge thank you to you, Prita, for being here with us and sharing your time, especially because you are still in the middle of your move back to Nebraska. So having moved quite a lot myself, wow, do I really doubly thank you, because that's a real period of transition. So anyone who has been here with us, thank you for your excellence, your courage, your exquisite hearts, and willingness to help us make the world a better place.
Thank you. And it's also Diwali, so happy Festival of Lights.
Right on.
Yeah, so may the good conquer evil in your lives.
Right on. Actually, sorry.
Before you go, Lisa, for all of our guests who are new to our chat, you guys can save the chat on the right-hand side of your viewer by going to the More button and clicking on it, and it'll save your chat into a Word document or a text document.
So, Prita, do you have time for one more brief sharing? Because or not? Because at the beginning, actually, I think it was you sent me a link to your share service. Wait, am I getting the wrong? Yeah, and you talked about. I think that's when it was. It opened your talk. No, it wasn't. It was a separate talk with this exquisite story about a person looking for their keys in the dark. And since you mentioned Diwali and light and dark and bringing light into our life, can we just conclude with that story?
Sure. I mean, it's an ancient parable. I think it's a very common in the Sufi tradition. But the story of the man looking for keys under a lamppost. I think many of you have probably heard of this, where a man is lost his keys and he's looking under a street lamp for his keys, and an officer comes up to him and says, starts looking with him, tries to help him, and he's looking for a while, and then he says, "Are you sure you lost your keys over here?" And then he said, "No, I lost them across the street." And he said, "So why are we looking over here?" He says, somewhat exasperated. And he said, "Because it's dark over there. The light's better over here." And it kind of points to what is a common condition, which is called the street light effect, which is that we often look for answers to the hardest and deepest questions, not in the hidden recesses of the dark where the true answers lie, but where we know to look, and which is often the wrong place. And so just kind of that notion of trying to open ourselves up and be willing to look in the dark for the harder answers.
Excellent. Thank you. And what a beautiful way to end. Thank you, everyone. May we have the courage to look in the dark and bring our light and open our hearts more. Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thank you. Bye. Have a great day, everybody. Great evening.
Bye-bye.